To build our bending form, the first step is to create a template with the curve we want to produce. I like to use a flexible spline for this. It's a great way to make elliptical and recurved shapes. It's important to have a clear line to work to, so make sure your pencil is sharp. I'm using 1/2 inch MDF to make this template. Once you have your curve laid out, cut the template out on the bandsaw. The closer you can cut to the line, the less work you will have to do later, but make sure not to cut past the pencil line. I like to use an edge belt sander to remove bandsaw marks and fair the curve. Just like you were using a router table, you want to move the piece against the direction of rotation to maintain control. And make sure to keep the piece moving so you don't end up with flat spots. You may need to do some additional work with a file. Try to keep as much of the file in contact with the surface of the template as possible to prevent putting the edge out of square. Keeping the file at a 45-degree angle to the face will help with this. Use your fingertips to check for dips and irregularities. Use the template to lay out the parts for the form. I am using 4 pieces of 3/4 inch MDF that will result in a form that is 3 inches wide. You will want your form to be slightly wider than the part you are bending. With the parts traced out, head back to the bandsaw to cut them out. You don't need to hug the line for this. I usually leave a 1/16 of an inch or so. We will be using the template and router table to pattern cut the first piece of the form. Screw the template to the form piece and then set the depth of the cut so that the bearing runs in the center of the template. I'm using a 3/4 inch bottom bearing flush cut bit. The bottom bearing is a good choice here because it keeps the majority of the cutting surface below the table, making it safer. Once the first piece is routed, remove the template and glue and screw the piece you just routed to the next part of the form. Now go ahead and route this piece in the same way. You may need to adjust the height of the cutter slightly to account for the thicker top piece. Continue building up and routing until all 4 pieces are together and flush. To make it easier to clamp the laminations to the form, I'm going to cut the bottom of the form parallel to the top. The thickness of the form is pretty arbitrary, but I usually find about 3.5 to 4 inches to be a good amount to keep it rigid. I'm using a combination square to lay out to 3.5 inches. Cut to the line on the bandsaw. This doesn't need to be a perfect cut, it's just for the clamps. The form is basically done at this point, but it needs a few final details. First, I add feet to the bottom so that I can clamp the form down. Then I mark some layout lines to indicate the center of my curve and the ends of my final piece. These will be helpful on glue up and also later for laying out my finished cuts. I put packing tape over the surface of the form as a glue release. Finally, I add some vertical blocks to one face of the form. These will help to keep the lamination square during glue up. The form is completed and ready for laminating.